At 5:17 a.m. on March 12, 1942, Commander Elias Rowland crouched behind a jagged ridge, the morning mist curling around his boots. Below him, the stone-walled fortress loomed. Massive, silent, unyielding. Everyone said it was impossible. Every assault over the last 5 years had failed. Entire battalions had tried. None had returned. Rowland's unit numbered just 118 men. Not enough by any measure. They were tired, hungry, and half of them had never seen a fight like this. Yet he didn't flinch. He had a plan. A dangerous, probably insane plan, but one he believed in. He whispered to his lieutenants, outlining it in low tones so only they could hear. They would climb the northern cliff, bypass the gate, and strike from behind. No siege, no bombardment, just speed and surprise. "If we fail," he said quietly, "we won't see tomorrow." The men nodded, faces pale in the early light. Some gripped their rifles like lifelines. Others stared at the fortress, as if willing it to give way. Rowland felt their fear. He understood it. He had felt it himself that morning, standing there, staring at walls taller than anything he'd ever climbed. But fear could be a tool. Focused right, it could make men unstoppable. By 5:45 a.m., they were ready. Knives strapped to belts, ropes coiled, fingers numb, hearts racing. Rowland took a last glance at the sunrise over the valley. Mist like smoke drifting across the river. This wasn't a fight. It was a gamble. A reckless, impossible gamble. And somehow he knew, just knew, fate might finally favor the bold. By 6:03 a.m., Rowland's men were inching toward the cliff face. Wet rocks cut their palms, but no one complained. Not aloud. Every creak of rope, every scrape of boot against stone made them acutely aware of how exposed they were. The fortress below hadn't stirred yet, not a guard in sight. It was almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Rowland checked his watch. 6:07. The tide of sunlight was starting to strike the eastern walls, revealing every crag, every arrow slit, every loophole that might betray them. He squinted, considering. Timing would have to be perfect. One slip, one stumble, and the whole squad could be slaughtered before they even touched the gates. "Keep it steady," he muttered to Sergeant Hale, who was leading the first rope team. Hale nodded, teeth gritted. His hands bled slightly from friction, but he moved like a machine, measured and silent. Behind them, the men followed in single file, breath shallow, eyes wide. The first phase of the plan was simple. In theory, they would scale the cliff, silently, and reach the fortress wall at the northwest corner, a point the enemy never thought anyone would attack. Then Rowland's hand signal would release the second team to silently neutralize the outer sentries. It was dangerous. Every part of the plan depended on absolute precision. One man making noise, one slip of a rope, one branch snapping under a boot. That one mistake would turn them into corpses before the alarm bell rang. Rowland's mind flicked to the reports he'd read weeks earlier. Every previous assault had failed because commanders followed the rules. Bombard the gates. Wait for reinforcements. March in line. They never considered a gamble like this. Too reckless, too bold, too human, he swallowed. There was no room for hesitation now. He adjusted his gloves, checked the knots on the ropes again. The men were watching him, waiting for the signal. Some were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, but from adrenaline, from the sharp bite of morning air, from the knowledge that every step up this cliff might be their last. Rowland took a deep breath. The mist swirled around him, curling like smoke, hiding the path ahead. Then he nodded. Hale understood immediately and gave a soft, barely audible, "Move." And just like that, the first rope team began their ascent. Every second felt like a minute. Every creak of the rope a hammer striking in the chests of the men below. Silence was their ally. Silence was their weapon. One misstep could shatter both. But for now, the cliff held them. The fortress remained unaware. The gamble had begun. And there was no turning back. By 6:15 a.m., the first team had reached a narrow ledge halfway up the cliff. Roland's heart was pounding, but he stayed calm, projecting steadiness. One glance downward reminded him just how far a fall could carry a man. Hale was already assessing the next anchor point, the ropes taut and trembling under weight. The men's breaths came in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded along their foreheads, and the mist clung to their clothes, soaking them through. One slip, one frozen finger on the cold, slick rock, and it would be over. Roland swallowed hard and reminded himself. They had trained for this. Every day for 6 weeks, they had practiced climbing walls, crossing narrow ledges, and moving silently through enemy territory. But practice was different. Practice didn't have enemy eyes staring back from the walls above. Practice didn't have life or death resting on a single handhold. At 6:22, Roland signaled with a subtle flick of his wrist. The second team, waiting below in the shadow of a thick outcropping, began their movement. Their target was a small sentry post near the northwest corner, far from the main gate but critical to the fortress's early warning system. If the sentries spotted the first team, the alarm bell would ring, and the gamble would be lost. Lieutenant Carver led the second team. He moved like a ghost, silent steps carefully measured against the soft, moss-covered stones. The men followed, one by one, faces set, eyes darting for shadows that might give them away. The fortress wall was taller than any of them had imagined, but they had planned for that. A grappling hook, tossed with precision, caught the battlements, and one by one they began the ascent. Back on the cliff, Roland watched Hale secure the first rope. The sun had risen enough to catch the top of the fortress walls now, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The sentries were still unaware. Roland felt the tiniest surge of hope, but it was fragile, delicate, and would shatter with one misstep. At 6:35, a faint noise drifted up from the fortress. A single bird startled from its perch. Roland's hand went to his knife instinctively, his senses alert. Hale froze. The men below froze. The world seemed to hold its breath with them. Then the sound passed. The climb resumed, slow and careful. Every finger, every toe, every rope knot mattered. The gamble wasn't just in the plan. It was in their execution, their nerve, their ability to ignore fear. And for now, the fortress still slept. Roland exhaled quietly, barely audible, and whispered, "Almost there." Every second mattered. Every movement could mean life or instant death. And Roland knew, with a clarity that made his stomach twist, that if they succeeded, it wouldn't be luck. It would be courage and recklessness. By 6:48 a.m., Roland and Hale reached the top of the cliff. The wind bit at their faces, carrying the faint scent of smoke and damp stone from the fortress below. They crouched behind the jagged rocks, scanning the courtyard. Soldiers moved in lazy patrols, unaware of the shadowed figures perched above. Roland counted 6 men on the first patrol. Hale's eyes flicked to the northwest tower, where another pair kept watch over the gate. Timing was everything. One wrong move, one snapped twig, and the alarm bells would ring, alerting the entire fortress. They had practiced this descent countless times in simulations, but simulations never smelled like gun oil or felt like the weight of 100 lives resting on your shoulders. Roland adjusted the grappling hook in his hands. 3 minutes, he whispered. Hale nodded. They had memorized every patrol pattern, every tower rotation. Precision was their only ally. The men below reached the base of the wall without incident. They planted their first ropes, anchoring them to weathered stones, testing the pull. One by one, they began the vertical climb. Fingers tore against rough edges. Boots scraped against the cold surface. But no alarm sounded. The fortress remained asleep, or indifferent. At 6:57, a sentry in the courtyard shifted his weight, eyes scanning the horizon. Roland held his breath, barely daring to blink. Hale's hand brushed the hook rope. a subtle reminder to stay still, to wait. The sentry muttered something, perhaps to his companion, then turned, moving out of sight. Roland exhaled slowly, relief flooding him for only a heartbeat before the next phase began. At 7:03, the first man reached the top of the fortress wall. He lay flat, scanning for danger. Roland signaled the others to follow, one by one. Silence was absolute. Not a single stone creaked. Not a single shadow betrayed them. The fortress, imposing and ancient, had never felt more vulnerable. By 7:10, the entire team had secured their position on the battlements. Roland surveyed the courtyard below. The main gate, heavily guarded, was their objective, but reaching it without detection required careful timing. Any misstep, any sound, and the gamble would be over. Hale whispered, "We move on my mark." Roland nodded. Every movement had to be synchronized, precise. The men tightened their grips on ropes, weapons ready, but fingers steady. Hearts pounded silently in chests, each beat a drum signaling courage and the reckless gamble they had taken. At 7:12, Roland glanced over the wall, eyes locking on the gate. The fortress was silent, too silent, and in that silence they found their chance. One swift move, one calculated risk, and the fortress could be theirs. But the next 2 minutes would test everything they had trained for, everything they dared to hope for. They dropped down into the courtyard like ghosts. At 7:14 a.m., Roland counted heads. 6 teams. One objective, the main gate, the place where every previous assault had died. The men moved with the careful, slow precision of people who knew what silence felt like, how it sat heavy in the throat, how a single whispered order could scar the air. No one ran, no one shouted. They walked, feet soft on stone, shadows folding into shadows. The gate stood massive, iron-banded and grim, 2 leaves bolted together with hinges the size of a man's head. A dozen defenders clustered nearby, half-turned, brushing down armor, talking in low voices about morning rations and shifts, close enough that one missed step could be fatal. Roland signaled with his hand. Carver and a small detachment moved to the left flank. Hale took point toward the right, and Roland himself led the breach team. 4 men with lock picks, small charges, and hands steady enough to ignore the pounding of blood in their ears. They reached the portcullis. The lock was old, thick with rust, but built to last. Roland crouched, palms cold, breath shallow. He slid a pick into the mechanism with practiced fingers, the kind of hands that had fiddled with locks back home on quiet nights, and now did the same on the edge of ruin. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the silence that followed. The fortress hummed like a sleeping beast, unaware, almost respectful of the audacity before it. A slight scrape, the pick catching on grit, and Roland froze. For a second, the world narrowed to the sound of his tools and the far-off clink of a pan in the cookhouse. He thought of his wife's letter, folded into his breast pocket, the way she had told him to come home. He thought of the men behind him. Hands steadier now, he worked the mechanism. The lock yielded with a soft, bitter click. Roland tasted iron in his mouth. He signaled the charge team. They set the small explosive carefully, the kind meant to break bolt heads, not tear the gate apart. Precision over force. A wrong blast and stone would fly, men would fall, alarm bells would shriek. The charge went on. A match struck. Roland's thumb brushed the fuse. It felt like the pulse of a living thing. Now, he breathed, a muffled thump. The bolt fractured. Hinges creaked. The gate gave a hair. They weren't through yet. There was a gap. A narrow, dark slit, just enough for a man to slip. Roland swallowed and led the way. Knife held forward. Breath shallow. Every sense stretched tight like wire. On the other side, the shock on the defenders' faces was a slow, dawning thing. Someone shouted, but it sounded far away, as if the courtyard had swallowed sound whole. Carver's team moved like a blade, silent and efficient. 2 men cutting off sentries, one covering the flank, another dragging a bell rope free and tying it so it wouldn't sound. That last move, small, cruelly simple, bought them crucial seconds. Rowland's team flooded through the gap. The courtyard smelled of wet straw, of sweat, of stale beer. It smelled like the lives they were about to change. For a breathless moment, chaos and training collided. A defender lunged for a spear. A blade flashed. A grunt cut through the hush. But the strike was surgical, not wild. Men were disarmed, not slaughtered. Hands tied, mouths gagged. The fortress did not fall into a bloody frenzy. It folded, disoriented and stunned, like a creature that's been lightly, precisely shaved instead of hacked. Hale found the main bell. He worked quickly, prying at the rope assembly until the thick cord came loose. He didn't cut it. He wound it and tucked it out of sight. Silence remained. At 7:22 a.m., Rowland climbed onto the gate platform and looked down. 24 defenders secured. A dozen more prisoners moved to the inner yard. The artillery positions were quiet. The gunners had been taken before they could blink. The courtyard was a sprawl of motion and shock, but there was no corpse. That fact sat in Rowland's chest heavier than relief. Not a single man had died. They moved fast after that, clearing towers, securing the armory, corralling officers. They used soft words when they could, hard hands when they had to. A captain argued at one point, voice sharp, eyes pleading. Rowland listened and then chose mercy. "We didn't come to kill you," he told the man. "Surrender now, and you keep your men." The captain's jaw worked. He spit, then nodded. It wasn't nobility, it was pragmatism. He knew his men were tired, confused, and that a full fight would only mean slaughter for both sides. He ordered the remaining soldiers to stack arms. They obeyed. Outside the gate, in the town below, a single bell began to toll. Not the alarm bell the fortress relied on, but the little chapel bell, rung by a frightened woman who'd seen soldiers on the wall. For a moment, Rowland worried the sound would ripple up and bring disaster. It did not. The men below moved to reassure townsfolk, to show restraint, to pacify panic. Their discipline held. By 7:35 a.m., the fortress's major defensive points were under control. Men were accounted for. The wounded, a handful with cuts and bruises from scuffles, were tended to right away. There were no mortal wounds, no bodies to bury. The phrase carved itself quietly into the men's faces. 0 losses. They had gambled and won. Rowland sat on a low stone and let his legs tremble. He thought of the cliff, the ropes, the cold palms of men who had trusted him enough to climb. He'd gambled on stealth and precision, not brute force. He'd gambled on the idea that discipline could win where cannon could not. The gamble had paid off, but it had also changed him. He felt the weight of every life under his command more acutely than before, as if each man's breath now rested in his own lungs. Outside, drums began to beat in the valley, not the drum of war, but of astonishment and rumor. Stonewall had fallen without a slaughter. Officers would argue later about chance and skill, about recklessness and strategy. That would come. For now, Rowland stood, looked over the courtyard, and let a long, private silence settle over him. The fortress was theirs. Every man in his command lived. The gamble had not been madness. Not today. Word spread through the valley like fire in dry grass. By midday, neighboring units were whispering the news. Rowland's team had taken Stonewall Fortress with 0 casualties. 0. The words repeated in barracks, taverns, and mess halls, as if disbelief alone could keep them from being true. Yet the men who had been there carried proof in bruises, in sweat-streaked faces, in silent pride. Captain Elridge, stationed 3 miles north, was the first senior officer to react. He didn't run to the fortress himself. Not yet. but he summoned his lieutenants, pacing the tent, voice low and clipped. "They've done what we said was impossible," he muttered. The words tasted wrong on his tongue. Impossible wasn't in military manuals, but now it had been rewritten. He ordered scouts to confirm. Men slipped along ridge lines, through coppices, and reported back. Every observation matched the story. No smoke of death, no draped banners of mourning. Only Roland's men, steady and intact, moving like shadows through a conquered fortress. By late afternoon, the ripple reached the command council. Maps were unfurled, markers shifted. Previous strategies relied on attrition, on wearing down defenses with cannon fire and siege. Now they faced a new reality. One small, well-coordinated strike could collapse a stronghold thought impregnable. The generals frowned at diagrams. Columns of troops that had been plotted for months were now unnecessary. In their place, plans pivoted to precision, stealth, and rapid strikes. Roland's gamble, once criticized in whispers as reckless, became a case study in audacity and timing. The men themselves noticed the change before the brass. Sentries along supply routes were less nervous. Townsfolk offered water and bread without suspicion. Word of zero losses circulated, carrying a subtle power. It wasn't just that the fortress had fallen. It was that men could fight, follow orders, and survive. Fear, long entrenched in the hearts of soldiers, began to loosen its grip. For weeks, morale had been a slow drip. Now it surged, buoyed by proof. Courage and discipline, not brute force alone, could preserve life. Roland's own men were quiet about their achievement. They didn't boast. There was no cheering in the fortress courtyard, only the soft sound of men cleaning weapons, tending the wounded, and keeping watch. Even the prisoners sensed it. The guards who had surrendered looked around, uneasy, as if the absence of blood made the whole enterprise unreal. They had expected carnage. Instead, they found method, precision, and mercy. Some would later speak of it as a miracle. Others would call it luck. Roland knew better. It was calculation married to nerve. By evening, word reached the enemy. Their messengers arrived in fragments, rumors folded into intelligence reports. Fortress Stonewall, once thought a bastion, had been captured without a single loss. Shock spread through the ranks. Officers questioned their scouts, the reliability of their spies, the integrity of their maps. How could a fortress of stone and iron fall quietly, with its defenders alive and intact? It didn't fit their doctrine, which relied on overwhelming force and fear as tools of control. The notion that an opposing commander could succeed without slaughter rattled them, planting doubt in every fortified position. Back in the fortress, Roland watched from the highest tower as dusk settled. The courtyard's stones glimmered in the fading sun, cold and unyielding, but now under his command. He thought of every man who had climbed the ropes, slipped past sentries, and faced the uncertainty of battle. Their trust had been his leverage, their lives the measure of his gamble. He understood. Something fundamental that night. War didn't always reward caution, and it rarely rewarded waiting. Sometimes it demanded a calculated leap, a moment where the impossible could be realized because someone dared to act when reason whispered no. The ripple effect was immediate. Neighboring units began emulating Roland's methods. Small teams, trained for precision and speed, moved on minor outposts and supply depots. Each success carried the same hallmark: minimal casualties, strategic gains far greater than the numbers involved, and the quiet hum of morale growing louder than the cannon. Reports filtered back to headquarters, their tone increasingly incredulous. Officers who had doubted Roland's strategy began to advocate for it, referencing his audacity as proof that the calculus of war could be rewritten. By the third day, the psychological impact became undeniable. Enemy commanders hesitated. They reinforced positions that Roland hadn't touched, diverted troops to areas that seemed less threatened, and began second-guessing intelligence reports. Small victories became large strategic advantages because hesitation breeds vulnerability. Roland's gamble hadn't just won a fortress. It had sown doubt, disrupted plans, and shifted the rhythm of an entire campaign. Letters from home found their way to the men, but they read differently now. Families wrote of ordinary days, of farms and markets and towns untouched by war, and the soldiers, hardened, disciplined, alive, clutched those words as proof that the world they fought for could endure. Every mission, every risk had meaning. Zero losses meant that the gamble had a tangible payoff, that survival was possible, that bravery could coexist with wisdom. For the first time in months, fear and hope coexisted in equal measure, each feeding the other. And in Roland's private moments, he grappled with the weight of it. The fortress, the men, the ripple effect. It all came down to choices made in a brief span, in seconds where hesitation could have meant death. He understood that history wouldn't remember the careful planning, the sleepless nights, the silent calculations. History would remember the outcome, the audacity, and the improbable victory. But he and the men under him carried the quiet knowledge of how thin the line between triumph and disaster had been. Night fell over Stonewall Fortress. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that merged with the growing dark. Soldiers ate quietly, cleaned weapons, and checked on one another. Roland sat against a tower wall, staring at the map they would review in the morning. Each mark represented strategy, but also trust, skill, and courage. In that moment, the fortress felt less like stone and iron and more like a living testament to calculated risk. Every soldier there had been part of something extraordinary, a gamble that had paid off not just in territory, but in lives. By the following morning, word of the operation had spread further. Commanders from neighboring regions requested briefings. They wanted to know how such an audacious strike could succeed. They wanted to replicate it. Roland briefed them quietly, careful to stress method over heroism. "We moved with precision," he said. "We moved with care. No one ran. No one shouted. We relied on timing, discipline, and trust. That's how you win without losing." And the men who had climbed ropes and slipped past sentries, who had faced the uncertainty of battle with nothing but nerve and preparation, nodded. They understood the truth. Sometimes survival itself was the message. Sometimes a single gamble could echo far beyond a courtyard, beyond a fortress, beyond the immediate war, reshaping everything around it. The march back from Stonewall Fortress was quieter than anyone expected. No fanfare, no cheering crowds. The soldiers were exhausted, but they carried a weight lighter than fear. Their steps were steady, deliberate, the kind that comes from surviving something impossible. They moved in ranks, yet each man felt the solitude of his own choices and courage. The memory of every rope climbed, every shadow slipped through, every heartbeat that had counted. Roland walked at the head, his eyes scanning the terrain, noting every ridge and hollow. The fortress behind them gleamed faintly in the morning sun, a silent monument to strategy and nerve. The men talked quietly, swapping stories in murmurs, laughter sparing but genuine. Some joked about the enemy guards who had surrendered without a fight. Others spoke of their own mistakes, minor slips that could have cost lives but didn't. There was humility in their triumph, a recognition that the victory belonged to each man as much as it did to Roland. At the village nearest the main road, the first signs of recognition arrived. Local officials, initially wary of soldiers returning from a hard-fought campaign, stepped forward with relief and curiosity. They had heard whispers of the fortress's fall without casualties, and now saw it confirmed by the soldiers themselves. Mothers and wives peered from windows. Children ran along the road to get a glimpse of men who had faced the impossible and come back whole. The soldiers waved, nodded, and acknowledged them with quiet smiles. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't a spectacle. It was acknowledgement. Subtle, human, earned. At headquarters, news traveled faster than Rowland's unit could march. Dispatches arrived from regional commanders, each one more incredulous than the last. Fortress taken, 0 losses, they read. Verification pending. Maps were unfolded again. Charts were redrawn. Officers who had doubted the audacity of Rowland's plan now studied the movement patterns, the timing of the strikes, the coordination of squads. Orders were drafted to replicate the strategy elsewhere. Small teams trained in stealth, speed, and precise timing, with explicit instructions to minimize casualties wherever possible. Rowland himself remained distant from the fanfare. He answered questions with calm precision, never exaggerating, never claiming heroism. The men followed orders, he said. We moved together. We stayed disciplined. That's why no one was lost. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet weight behind it, the acknowledgement that luck and timing had been as crucial as courage. Every question from officers or reporters was met with the same focus: strategy over heroics, discipline over chance. Recognition came in other forms. Letters from commanders commending the unit arrived, formal citations detailing the tactical brilliance of the operation. Soldiers were given medals and ribbons, yet Rowland noticed that the men treated these symbols differently than they would have expected. They pinned the awards carefully, but more as reminders of what they had accomplished than as marks of personal glory. In the barracks, the medals caught the morning light, glinting against the walls, yet the true measure of recognition was in the respect of peers, the quiet nods from fellow soldiers who had shared the danger. The enemy, meanwhile, reassessed their own strategies. Fortress Stonewall had been a cornerstone of their defense, assumed impregnable, and now it was proof that even the strongest positions could fall. Intelligence reports filtered back to them, describing the audacity, timing, and precision of the strike. Officers debated and argued, unable to fully comprehend how 0 losses had been achieved. Their troops, shaken by the loss of the fortress without bloodshed, began to question the doctrine that had previously seemed infallible. Morale, once solid, faltered. Hesitation spread through their ranks. Rowland watched all of this with a quiet understanding. Victory was not just a tally of territory gained or enemies defeated. It was the change it inspired, the ripple effects that would influence campaigns and decisions far beyond the battlefield. A single gamble, executed with care and courage, had altered perceptions, shifted morale, and created opportunity where none had existed before. The men knew it, the commanders knew it, and eventually, the historians would know it too. When Rowland finally returned to his hometown weeks later, he was greeted not with the grandeur of war heroes, but with the warmth of ordinary life. Children ran to greet him, neighbors shook his hand, and friends asked questions, not about medals or maps, but about survival. Each story he told was measured, human, filled with the smells, the sweat, and the quiet moments of tension that no official report could capture. The fortress, the gamble, the 0 losses, all of it became legend in conversation. Not because of exaggeration, but because reality itself had been extraordinary. Recognition at the national level followed more slowly. Reports of the campaign were published, articles written, medals confirmed. But the nuance, the quiet bravery, the calculated risk, the men who had survived because of trust and discipline, was rarely captured. Rowland never minded. He understood that the story belonged to the men, to the choices made in the shadows of stone walls, to the calculation that saved lives where doctrine might have demanded blood. Years later, when veterans of the campaign gathered to reminisce, the story was told again and again, not with bravado, not with exaggeration, but as a lesson in courage, precision, and trust. Young soldiers listened, wide-eyed, learning that audacity could coexist with discipline, that careful planning could protect life even in the chaos of battle, that a single gamble, measured and deliberate, could alter the course of an entire campaign. Roland lived long enough to see the ripple of his decision echo through training programs, manuals, and the memories of soldiers who carried the lessons into future conflicts. He never sought fame. He never wanted statues or plaques. The true recognition was in the lives preserved, the confidence restored, and the proof that courage, when married to precision, could achieve the impossible. And so, the story of Stonewall Fortress became more than a tale of strategy or audacity. It became a human story, about trust, about decisions in the shadow of danger, about the quiet dignity of soldiers who moved as one. Victory without loss was not just a tactical achievement. It was a testament to what could happen when leadership understood the value of every life, when discipline guided courage, and when a single, reckless gamble was executed with the precision of careful minds and brave hearts. Years passed, and the story of Stonewall Fortress didn't fade. Not because it was written in dispatches or featured in glossy magazines, but because it lived in the memory of those who had been there. Veterans told the story quietly in barracks, over mugs of coffee, in the dim glow of evening fires. Each retelling emphasized different details. Some spoke of the impossible climb up the fortress walls, others of the precision of the strikes, the timing, the discipline. Every account carried the same undercurrent. 0 losses, achieved through courage, calculation, and trust. Roland, now older, rarely spoke of the campaign outside official circles. He understood the temptation to turn the story into legend, to embellish, to make it larger than life. But the truth, he knew, was extraordinary enough. The gamble, the meticulous planning, the men who trusted him, the way each soldier moved as if instinct alone guided them. That was more impressive than any embellishment could ever be. For him, the story was about people, about choices, about the moments where hesitation could have been fatal, and precision was everything. In training rooms years later, instructors told recruits about Stonewall Fortress. They spoke not only of strategy but of responsibility. They highlighted how leadership mattered, how preparation saved lives, how understanding the human element, fear, fatigue, trust, could turn a desperate gamble into a calculated victory. Roland's approach became a case study, referenced for decades. It was cited in manuals, analyzed in tactical seminars. But the human element was always the point. Every successful maneuver traced back to trust in his men. Every avoided casualty to attention to detail and the courage to act when conventional wisdom suggested caution. Survivors of the fortress operation carried the lessons for the rest of their lives. Some rose through the ranks, applying the same principles in campaigns far removed from the cliffs and stone walls of that morning. Others returned to civilian life, forever changed by the experience of shared survival, the understanding that courage combined with discipline could produce extraordinary results. Families often noticed the quiet confidence in their husbands, brothers, fathers. It wasn't arrogance, it was calm, earned from knowing they had faced something impossible and returned intact. Even decades later, historians would marvel at the campaign. Archival research uncovered reports that hinted at the audacity of Roland's plan, but official records could never capture the full picture. The tension in the air, the sweat on brows, the calculated risks taken in real time. Witness accounts, letters, and diaries told a story that no map or dispatch could. Men moving with cohesion, leaders balancing audacity and precision, the extraordinary execution of a gamble that, on paper, should have cost lives. Roland never sought recognition, yet it came quietly, in small ways. Former soldiers found him years later, bringing photographs, medals, letters, or just gratitude. They didn't need grand ceremonies or national attention. A handshake, a shared look, a quiet word of thanks was enough. He remembered the fear in their eyes the night before the assault, the way each man prepared his own equipment meticulously, the silent prayers whispered in the dark. Every expression of gratitude reminded him that the true measure of a leader wasn't the glory, but the lives preserved under his guidance. By the time the fortress had faded into history, the lessons had traveled far beyond the battlefield. Military academies studied the operation as an example of low-risk, high-reward tactics. Leadership courses referenced Roland's emphasis on preparation, trust, and the careful assessment of risk. Psychologists analyzed the cohesion and morale of the unit, noting how shared purpose and confidence in leadership prevented panic and loss. The story was cited in books, lectures, and seminars, always with the same moral. Audacity, when combined with discipline and care, could save lives and achieve the impossible. At home, Roland lived a quiet life. He worked his farm, repaired machinery, and spent evenings with family. The accolades were few, the headlines none, but the memories stayed vivid. Every August, he thought of the fortress, the climb, the gamble, the silence, and the cheers that never came. The zero losses haunted him not because of pride, but because he knew how fragile life could be, how thin the line between survival and disaster, and how much depended on trust, discipline, and a willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. And the men remembered him. Always. Not for the medals or the dispatches, but for the courage to make a decision no one else would. For the clarity to see the human element in a war often obsessed with numbers. For the skill to turn fear into a disciplined, precise action. They remembered the calm in his eyes when the fortress walls loomed, the steady hand that guided them, and the quiet words of assurance that transformed uncertainty into focus. Stonewall Fortress became more than a historical moment. It became a lesson in leadership and humanity. It was proof that audacity, when paired with careful calculation and trust in people, could defy expectations and rewrite outcomes. And long after the stones had crumbled and the soldiers had aged, the story endured, carried in conversations, in lectures, in personal recollections, and most importantly, in the lives of those who returned home because one commander dared to gamble with precision, care, and faith in his men. In the end, that was the legacy. Not fame, not medals, not stories in print, but the quiet knowledge that human courage, guided by discipline and trust, could achieve what seemed impossible. That the measure of a leader was not in the victories claimed or the enemies defeated, but in the lives saved and the humanity preserved. Roland's gamble was reckless on paper, but it became the blueprint for what leadership, in its truest form, could accomplish.